Chapter 13 of The Bonnot Gang by Richard Perry. In the Belly of the Beast. Living is just the problem. Raymond Calliman. Limbo. Over the next few months, the examining magistrate, Monsieur Gilbert, interviewed all the accused and sifted through the massive evidence in order to test the strength of the prosecution case. None of the defendants made any admissions of guilt, but several declined to give alibis because, so they said, this would implicate other comrades in matters for which they could be charged. Any stolen goods found in their possession had been left in their safekeeping by other comrades, who obviously they could not name. Most of the prosecution's evidence was circumstantial. The nature of events surrounding the most serious crimes remained obscure, and even the identities of the participants could not be established with any certainty. Two warrants were still outstanding. One for the veteran Russian anarchist Godorowski, for letting the gang use his flat in Rue Courtot, and the other for André Poyer, for supplying stolen weapons to the gang earlier in the year. Godorowski was never heard of again, but detectives caught up with Poyer on the 20th of June and found him in possession of no less than 3 revolvers and a capsule of potassium cyanide. A search of his room revealed a complete burglar's kit, 2 flasks of chloroform, and a formula for the manufacture of explosives. 6 months to the day after the Rue Ordinaire robbery, the Surete had at last solved the case and tied up all the loose ends. On September 12th, all 21 defendants were formally charged, to appear before the assize court of the Seine in December. There were 26 separate counts on the indictment covering 8 charges of murder or attempted murder and 18 thefts over the period from January 1911 to May 1912. Amongst the separate charges were murder, attempted murder, wounded assault, armed robbery, robbery with violence, burglary, unlawful possession of firearms, theft, and receiving stolen goods. A general charge of criminal conspiracy was laid against the defendants under the provisions of the second of the infamous wicked laws passed in 1894 in response to Vaillant's bombing of the Chamber of Deputies. The prosecution sought to establish that there had been a criminal association centered on the premises, both theoretical and material, of l'Anarchie, first at Romainville and then at Rue Fessart. As the gang's ideological mentors, Victor and Rirette, were made the pivot of the conspiracy, despite the fact that they played no active role in any of the gang's crimes. But the prosecution argued l'Anarchie had shared in the proceeds of these robberies and burglaries, which had helped sustain the weekly paper as well as the needs of comrades. In turn, members of the gang could find shelter there and get hold of guns and false papers. As the activities of the Bonnot gang had become almost legendary, a few individuals attempted copycat crimes, something that the police and the London Times correspondent had feared might happen following their spectacular treatment in the press. Attacks were made on passing automobiles in the Clermont woods and the forest of Senart and Senlis. The attempted ambushes in the forests of Senart actually took place in the same spot as the illegalists had hijacked the de Bion-Bouton, but this time the drivers escaped unharmed with their vehicles. In the other incidents, the men responsible were promptly arrested. 2 young criminals arrested in Beauvais in June avowed complicity in all the affairs of the gang, saying that they had assisted Garnier and Valet set up some gymnastic apparatus in Nogent, where they themselves had subsequently rented their own houses. Their stories were disbelieved. Confessions did not come from the guilty in this affair, according to the police. Meanwhile, the accused languished in prison. The 18 men in Lasante and the 3 women, Rirette, Marie, and Barbe, in Saint Lazare. Rirette later complained about the hard regime that was imposed upon them all. Their laces, ribbons, and pins were removed, making it hard to dress, and they were searched every morning and evening. Every 10 minutes a warder looked in, making it even harder to sleep in the whitewashed cell, which was permanently illuminated by an electric light. Still, she tried to make the best of it by teaching Barbie to read, during the periods of association. Marie, however, seemed lost in a world of her own. The regime was equally hard for the men. Louis Rimbaud had already attacked a warder, then began to exhibit signs of mental instability, warranting his transfer to a mental hospital. Monsieur Boucheron, the leading defense lawyer who had defended the individualist anarchists previously, was approached by a psychologist, Amel Méchain, who asked if he might do a study of some of the leading bandits. It was accepted that he could regularly visit Raymond Lascience, André Saudi, Eli Monnier, Edward Caroy, Eugene Dudon, and Jean Debeau, in order that he might delve into their souls and hopefully light upon something that explained their abnormal and antisocial behavior. He was rather surprised by his findings. He found these young anarchists to be intelligent, surprisingly calm and good humored, and always desirous of good conversation or argument. They were very fond of writing poetry and of reading philosophical, literary, and scientific works, and engaging in discussion about such subjects. Raymond, in particular, he saw as the brains of the gang, and talked to him of life, love, and of course science. They even exchanged letters in which Michon discovered how, behind all the talk of science and reason governing life, Raymond was at heart a true romantic. All the illegalists tried to stay relatively fit and healthy by doing their Swedish exercises and keeping to a vegetarian diet. Michon felt that it was this keen interest in keeping a healthy mind and body that kept them going, and stopped them from being quite so crushed as some other prisoners. As 1912 drew to a close, with the trial now postponed to February, the accused concentrated on their defenses, with the aid of the 15 barristers instructed to defend them. They all decided to declare their total innocence on all counts, and to leave the question of their anarchism to each individual. On this last point, Raymond was having doubts. On Christmas Eve, he wrote to Arthur Mallet, "I don't know if I am an anarchist. Many are in this case. I am convinced that the individuals of the Rue Ordinaire were good people wanting to live. That's all." Victor and Moret, accused of being the theoreticians behind the gang's actions, were anxious to put forward a more high-profile defense, which would separate them from the other defendants. They took their cue from the famous anarchist trial of the 30 in 1894, in which 19 leading theoreticians found themselves in the dock beside 11 professional expropriators. The first group were acquitted, after the prosecution had failed to establish any material link between them and the burglars, who were all convicted. Victor and Moret hoped to present themselves to the jury as simple journalists cum propagandists, who had absolutely nothing to do with the heinous crimes of the Bonnot gang, but were only being arraigned because the state was intent on criminalizing the anarchist movement, as it had tried to do in the 1890s. Unfortunately, this type of defense put Victor and Moret in rather an awkward position regarding the others, who were afraid that such a presentation might suggest to the jury that the others were indeed members of the gang. Victor was obliged to try and explain himself in a tortuous letter to Armand, who had by now given up the editorship of L'Anarchie to Delmeyer. He wrote as follows: "How many comrades, including yourself, are mistaken about our views? Certainly we have the desire soon to live again, a passionate desire to see an end, whatever it may be, to this stupid, unwarranted nightmare. But if I am associated, by the prosecution, with acts which repulse me, I write the correct term, I will have to explain myself. In this case I will do it, be sure, in terms clear enough so that my words cannot be used against our co-defendants. Besides, do I need to tell you that if the prosecution tried to make use of an always possible slip of the tongue, I would rectify it? It's not self-interest that makes me not want a forced solidarity at any price. If it was only a question of my interest, the defense could get round the difficulty. But no, it is that we are disgusted, deeply aggrieved, to see that comrades that I have had affection for since their first and purest passions, could commit things as deplorable as the butchery of thighs. I am heartbroken to see that the others, all the others, have madly wasted and lost their lives in a pointless struggle, so tragic that, beneath the facade of such desperate courage, they cannot even defend themselves with self-respect. I will try to find a way in court either to avoid or to make Madame Elbreton avoid tackling the questions of illegalism, to which these sad events seem to have given the all too evident conclusion. If I can't achieve that, I won't mention it, even then. I will restrict myself to proving that never have I advocated, nor have I ever been a partisan of that theory. I will add, nevertheless, that I have defended the rebels every time that it was necessary to do so. If I am soon free, it goes without saying that I will explain the above more straightforwardly. I believe it necessary after these experiences to bring things to a conclusion. I am sorry for not having done so long ago. Perhaps if I had been more steadfast, Valet would be alive and poor Saudi free. Only I lacked the will to fight it out. However, you wrote to me. One can still object to you after your articles in L'Anarchie by bringing up certain details from your past life that, no, one cannot. If I allowed myself to approve in front of the jury of acts of comrades who are no longer theoretical adversaries, but really crushed people, using Merrick's terminology, then surely many objections could be raised against me. But if I say that I have never been a partisan to a disastrous system of action, whether I say it later as I mean to, or whether I am forced to say it to the jury, one cannot raise any objections against me, for it is true. My articles in L'Anarchie, have I done nothing other than defend the illegalist, or have I made use of situations to promote our way of thinking, and the legitimacy of all revolts, which doesn't mean to say that I advocate all of them. Didn't I write in the most militant amongst them, the bandits, that the bandits are the effects of causes situated above them? At Libre Richard, at the Causerie Populaire, Rue de Clingancourt, at Romainville, in many a discussion, I said how much I dreaded illegalism. Obviously, I wasn't able to push this, given that it may have been necessary to support my arguments with documents out of place in public meetings. I contradicted Lorillot on the subject one evening, which Paris comrades must remember. And I had at the time 3 opponents, our excellent Valliere, 5 years valet, dead, Pierre Jacob, remanded in custody, and Mantes. Don't you remember that from your first visit to Romainville we spoke of illegalism, and that I told you I had numerous reasons which decided me against it? Shortly before taking up the editorship of the paper, I had moreover made myself refuse a very too fair article on the same subject. And a few days before my arrest, I spoke to Léonard of La Vie Anarchiste, of why in our paper I didn't wish to publish my feelings on illegalism. He even offered with Boutard to insert the copy that I had shown him. You see, one can neither bring up my articles nor our past life. That besides constitutes a chapter which I will not allow to be brought up for discussion. Without being a supporter of waged work, I could be waged. Without being a supporter of theft, I may be forced to make use of it. That is my concern alone. That people discuss my ideas, I desire. That people discuss my actions, which only concern myself, I will not allow. In other words, I may let people talk and slander me, but I won't consent to a debate about it. What I've recounted about is only to show you that you needn't see a change in attitude, as you've written, in our conduct. Moreover, if there was a change of attitude, it would be understandable. The experiences which are drawing to an end are well made up to abolish illusions and correct theories, alas. Give me the pleasure of making this letter known to the comrades with whom you've conversed about our defense. As I conclude, I've just got word from Rouret, who rightly expresses the opinion that we must enter into explanations of this nature, only if we are forced to. I will address your letter for publication after the trial. In the case that I am found guilty, I give myself 60 chances in 100 of acquittal, not one more. Wishing you well, Le Retif. Armand and the other comrades may be forgiven for thinking that Victor had done an about-face on the question of illegalism and armed struggle. Of all the anarchist individualist propagandists, he had been the most combative, the one who sang the praises of Sokolov and the Sydney Street revolutionaries, and even the bandits with whom he was allegedly incarcerated. It was true that he had said that the bandits had arisen in a situation not of their own making, but that of the truism, akin to Marx's dictum, that people make history, but not in circumstances of their own choosing. The overall impression created by his articles was extremely favorable to illegalism. Besides this, the major obstacle to his simple propagandist defense was his possession of two stolen Brownings, which provided a direct material link to tie him in with the rest of the gang. He was being rather generous to bourgeois justice in giving himself a 60% chance of acquittal. Meanwhile, some of the comrades in neighboring cells were thinking less of defense and more of attack, in the form of an attempted breakout. One prisoner called Akerlin was not connected with the gang and was not being as closely watched and managed to smash a way through the cell's skylight and crawl through into the warder's room next door. Once inside, he donned a spare uniform and armed himself with a revolver, then studied the piece of paper that had been supplied to him, indicating the way out and the numbers of some cells to open, those of Kalaman, Karoy, and other members of the gang. The gang's hope of escape were dashed when a passing warder noticed Eckerlin's absence. Trapped inside the warder's cell, he was captured and disarmed. From now on, all the prisoners in that section were carefully watched, and it was announced that special security precautions could be taken for the trial, to be held at the Palais de Justice on the Ile de la Cite. Judgment. In Paris, the anarchist individualists continued to step up their propaganda drive in anticipation of the forthcoming trial, while certain sections of the bourgeois press were preparing to put anarchism itself on trial, much to the chagrin of the anarcho-syndicalists, who were equally determined to show that the defendants had nothing to do with true anarchism. Armand had given up the nominal editorship of L'Anarchie in September to Delmeyer, a week after complaining that he was fed up with all the parasites who were hanging around their new premises in Rue des Amandiers without contributing anything. Meanwhile, musical and artistic matinees and soirees were held as benefits for the prisoners, and meetings were organized. In December, the singer Bonnot was arrested and prosecuted for his article From Rue Ordinaire to Aubray, but this did not discourage Fourcade, who had taken over the editorship in the new year, from publishing a series of pertinent pamphlets, namely a justification of crime, the criminal before the courts, and the real bandits. But he rather overreached himself with the front page article, sporting the banner headline Aux 12 Fantoches, to the 12 puppets, which contained a series of implied threats to the serving jurors, if they were to rash as to return the wrong verdict. Interestingly, though, it gave a breakdown of the status of the 40-strong jury panel, which was made up of 9 small businessmen. For Rentier, 3 landlords, 4 tradesmen, 1 stockbroker, 2 legal clerks, 1 retired senior officer, and 16 others, including doctors, engineers, and bank employees. L'Anarchie then gave the names and provocatively the addresses of all those chosen to serve, and listed their professions: doctor, civil engineer, rentier, car manufacturer, stockbroker, legal clerk, landlord, small businessman, tradesman, engineer, a retired man, and an employee from Noisy. The standbys were a landlord and a rentier. In other words, it was a petty bourgeois jury par excellence, and the outcome was surely almost a foregone conclusion, for the implied threats to these brave gens. Forçat was hauled off to jail, and René Mauritius took over. The trial had opened on Monday, the 3rd February 1913, and all around the Palais de Justice, special security measures were in force. Not only were the general public completely barred from entering the building, but no crowds were allowed to gather outside the court, groups being dispersed and forced to stand across the road in the Place Dauphine. Troops guarded the so-called public entrance, while inside, the building was continuously patrolled by armed police and the Republican Guards, some of the latter being placed as sentries at the entrances of the courtroom. The public gallery was packed with police and a few carefully selected invitees, while journalists were vetted and only allowed in on production of a pass signed by the president of the court. Despite this stringency, the dock itself had been altered to exclude any possibility of communication between the accused and the public. Each prisoner was guarded by a warder, and the six more desperate characters were in the custody of the Republican guards. Sitting in three rows behind the 15 defense counsel, most of the men looked like workers in their Sunday best, some looking anxious, others affecting an air of indifference. Viktor Kovalchich was distinguished by his Russian peasant-style blouse, while Rirette, wearing a black blouse and her dark hair cut in a bob, appeared very young, and attracted the sympathy of the press, who compared her to the naive Claudine, heroine of Colette's famous series of novels. Arranged on the tables between the barristers and the judge's dais, there were approximately 700 exhibits, including a notably impressive collection of firearms. The jury had to hear the evidence of between 200 and 300 witnesses and decide on 383 matters. In case the newly installed electric lighting failed, a gas supply was laid on, and the court was supplied with oil lamps and candles, so that there would be no interruptions to the administration of justice. A film crew was refused permission to capture the proceedings on celluloid. All in all, it had the features of a show trial. Before proceedings commenced, the judge directed that this was not a political trial and announced his intention to prevent the importation of any political element into the trial. He then asked Lescov, the public prosecutor, to open the case. In his opening, he outlined the salient features of the prosecution case and the intention to prove a general conspiracy among all the defendants, whom he classed in 5 categories. First, there were the 6 principal offenders: Kalaman, Saudi, Monnier, Dudon, Karoy, and Medj. Then 5 intermediaries: Debeau, Belloni, Rodriguez, Detweiler, and Crozat de Fleury. 5 harborers: Gauzy, Jourdan, Reinhardt, Kibalchich, and the absent Godorowski. 2 providers of firearms: Bernard and Poyer, Rimbaud being in a mental hospital. And lastly, the 3 women: Henriette Maitre-Jean, Marie Wolleman, and Barbe Leclerc, graciously defined by Lescov according to their sex rather than by their alleged criminal role. The case proceeded at a remarkably quick pace, so that all the prosecution and defense evidence had been heard after 2 weeks. Dudon's alibi that he was in Nancy in the week leading up to Christmas 1911 was supported by several witnesses, but the bank messenger, Cabby, insisted that he was the attacker in Rue Ordinaire. He did indeed have some similarities to Garnier with his thick black mustache and hair, but unlike the latter, he was a right-handed Cabby. Cabby said that his assailant was left-handed. Kellerman treated the proceedings with the lofty indifference characteristic of the young romantic faced with the scaffold. Sometimes he refused to answer questions put to him, and on occasion argued mildly with the judge over the ethics of anarchism. His defense, like that of the others, was that he was honest and industrious, an anarchist. Yes, but that didn't make him a criminal. The stolen property found in his possession had been left in his care by friends, but he would rather assume the responsibility than betray comrades. Karoy and Medj admitted that they had done some minor burglaries, being driven to it by poverty. The property stolen from Thai had been given to him by a valet. Under cross-examination, the detective in charge of the case admitted that no less than 10 different people had been charged with the murders and burglary of Thais. So Lescov was forced to call his expert forensic witness, Monsieur Berthelon. He had previously developed a system of human identification based on the proposition that a fully developed adult's bones varied in dimension from person to person. But the success of his system depended too much on the technical skill of the measurer, and Berthelage was abandoned when the uniqueness of the fingerprint was discovered. Berthelon was now called to give evidence as an expert in the science of fingerprinting. In the face of Medj's denials, the judge intervened. He said that the fingerprints found could only be made by the fingers of a cook, and you are a cook. Confronted with such inexorable logic, Medj was lost for a reply. Antoine Gauzy denied being an anarchist and said that he was first introduced to Monnier as a friend of his relatives in Nimes, a few days after the Chantelet robbery. As for Bonnot, he honestly thought he was a Russian revolutionary. Similarly weak defenses were put up by the rest of the accused, and seemed unlikely to bring about their acquittal, so defense counsel were forced to discredit the prosecution evidence, much of which was clearly contradictory. Better still, evidence was adduced to show that Guichard and other detectives had beaten up defendants, concocted depositions, and pressed witnesses into making dubious identifications, as well as offering a deal for anybody who would give evidence for the prosecution. The next day in the Chamber of Deputies, the socialist deputy of the Val demanded Guichard's resignation for the inexcusable way he had treated Gauzy. Needless to say, his call went unheeded. It was left to Victor Kovalchich and Maret Maitragin to play the old established tactic of trying to separate the criminal illegalists from the honest intellectuals. If this had worked at the trial of the 30, 20 years later, circumstances were rather different. In 1894, no material links could be established between the Ortiz gang and the propagandists of the word, including Jean Grave and Sebastien Faure, who outnumbered the former by 19 to 11. In the present trial, Victor and Maret were a minority of two, besides being intimately known to the principal defendants with whom they lived as comrades. Most serious of all, the two revolvers found at their address established a direct material link between them and the Bonnot gang. Kovalchich called two men from the editorial board of Le Libertaire to explain the distinction between anarchists and bandits, and then seeking to prove that he was one of the former, put Lorillot in the witness box and argued that both he and Lorillot were propagandists who should be in the same boat. But why had Lorillot not been charged? After all, he had been editor of L'Anarchie and had known the bandits equally well. Unfortunately, Victor's attempt to draw a parallel between himself and Lorillot did not convince the jury, not least because of the question of the two guns found in his flat. More importantly, though, his line of defense was suggesting that the others in the dock were indeed bandits, whereas he was simply an honest anarchist. The trial was now reaching its climax in an atmosphere of tension, which had been increased by the news of the hunt for the anarchist Lacombe, nicknamed Le Chien, the dog. The previous weekend, scores of Parisian detectives had laid siege to no less than 3 different houses in the desperate hope of tracking down the double murderer, but to no avail. To the press and the police, it seemed as if there might be no end to this string of anarchist desperados. It was against this background that, with the hearing of evidence concluded, Lescauve began his speech for the prosecution. Despite the direction to the contrary, which the judge himself had ignored on occasion, Lescauve felt obliged to address himself to the question of politics. Most prisoners called themselves anarchists and sought to clothe their crimes with some vague system of social philosophy. If they'd killed and robbed, they would argue it was not because they were bandits, but because they were ardent and convinced partisans of certain doctrines, and because they dreamed of suppressing the present organization of society by violence, as it did not correspond with their aspirations. This, declared the public prosecutor, was their own argument, and they were even proud of it. Their search for a formula with which to cloak their crimes was the strongest feature of the trial. The criminal anarchism of the prisoners, manifesting itself in murder, theft, and terrorism, which left sorrow and ruin in its wake, this criminal anarchy which shot people down without mercy, had, it was argued, been merely a practical expression of the theories propounded by the prisoners. Yet how little in accordance with previous ideas of anarchism were the gang's activities. In days gone by, anarchists had worked for ends very different from material gain. But the accused, under cover of anarchism, had formed a gang which had no other object than murder and robbery. On February 20th, at -5 degrees, the coldest day of the whole winter, Lescauve demanded 6 heads. The guillotine for Calaman, Saudi, Monnier, Dudon, Caroy, and Medj, and forced labor for life, in slang la guillotine sèche, or the dry guillotine for the rest. During his speech, which had in fact lasted more than a day, Lescauve had allowed himself to express an apparent sympathy for the ideals of anarchism, even using a form of argument propounded by Jean Grave and other anarchists who despised the illegalists. He had welded together different pieces of each person's defense and certain admissions to form a general criminal anarchist conspiracy from which none of the accused could escape. The next days were occupied with speeches from the 15 defense counsel, each addressing themselves to facts at issue in each particular case, and stressing that almost all the prosecution evidence was circumstantial, leaving considerable room for doubt. The so-called conspiracy was a police fabrication, without any real substance. The trial drew to a close on the 26th, and the defendants were given an opportunity to say a last few words in their defense. In a few confused sentences, Raymond complained of the portrait painted of him by the prosecution, saying that he was a philosopher, not a bandit. Then he stopped short and asked his barrister, Monsieur Bruno Dubron, to finish off, as he was unable to do so. Andre Saudi, with some difficulty, tried a little better. I am innocent, but I do not know what tomorrow has in store for me. Whatever your verdict may be, I am an anarchist, and I will remain an anarchist. But I am not a bandit, and there is no trace of blood on my hands. You will not condemn a guiltless man, and I hope that you will allow me to take my place once more at the banquet of life. If you do, I will live a life of solitude and regret for the errors of my past. I am not the man with the rifle. Karoy admitted that he'd committed some crimes, but not Fives, and the jury could do with him as they wished. Medj declared his innocence and asked them to have pity on him for the sake of his ill child. Rodriguez said that he might be used to prison, but that was no reason to add an 11th year to the 10 he'd already done in the course of his life. Dudon said nothing. Gauzy emphatically swore that he was innocent. Rivette wept piteously when called upon to speak and pleaded for mercy for herself and her two young daughters. Victor, however, had prepared something lengthier, and the Times reported his speech as follows, under the cross-heading, A Self-Righteous Prisoner. Kovalchich defended himself at the expense of his fellow prisoners, with whom he soon became involved in a heated argument. Kovalchich is a typical street corner orator, and has throughout the proceedings striven to impart to this sordid criminal trial an atmosphere of political idealism. I am glad that the end of this nightmare has been reached, he said in a weak voice. There is an enormous difference between Madame Maitre Jean and myself, and these are fellows in the dock. You gentlemen of the jury, you have surely said to yourselves, these two are neither bandits nor thieves. They are propagandists. I have no desire to sacrifice people I have known, but I do not pretend to defend them, and if I have suffered in prison, it was at the thought of the fine forces which were lost to anarchy in the sieges of Nogent and Choisy-le-Roi. My fellow prisoners are also anarchists, and you may say that my theories have led them to theft and murder. However, that is not so, for a gulf separates philosophical anarchists from those who committed the crimes of Montgerin and Chantelet. The other prisoners had followed Kovalchich's speech with growing impatience, and at this point Raymond Lascience exclaimed in furious tones, Don't you say that. You don't know whether the bandits were anarchists. You're trying to separate yourself from your comrades, and it's cowardly. Kovalchich, having again sought to show the difference between himself and his fellow prisoners, Raymond Lascience once more interrupted him with the exclamation, This is becoming idiotic, and you bore me. Don't go on calling us murderers. I am innocent. From all the prisoners arose the same protest, and some time elapsed before Kovalchich was able to conclude his very personal defense. The judge gave his final directions to the jury, then sent them out. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Perhaps they were somewhat comforted to know that Forçade, who had been responsible for publishing their names in L'Anarchie, had been sentenced the previous week to 5 years in jail, and fined 1,000 francs. The 12 petty bourgeois gentlemen prepared to execute their duty. Execution. Just before dawn the next morning, the jury returned their verdicts. After a 13-hour deliberation, Rodriguez and the three women, Rivette, Barbe, and Marie, were unanimously found not guilty on all counts, but the rest of the defendants were found guilty as charged, except for Gauzy, who was cleared of complicity in Joenne's murder, but found guilty of harboring a wanted criminal. They asked the judge to be lenient towards Karoy and Medj, who had not been shown to be seriously involved in the crimes of the Bonnot gang. At one point, as the foreman had returned a guilty verdict against Dudon, Raymond had jumped to his feet and shouted out that he was innocent. But it was too late. At 7:55 a.m., the judge pronounced sentence. For Raymond Calaman, death. For Andre Saudi, death. For Eli Monier, death. For Eugene Dudon, death. Raymond received his sentence with a sardonic smile on his lips, while the others seemed rather stunned. The judge exercised his power of clemency in the cases of Medj and Croy, forced labor for life. For Jean de Beau, 10 years forced labor and 5 years in exile. Bernard, 6 years in prison, 5 in exile. Poirier, 5 in prison, 5 in exile. Kibalchich, the same. Crozat de Fleury, 5 years in prison. Detweiler and Belloni, 4 years apiece. Gauzy and Jourdan, 18 months, and Reinhardt, a year. 1 month was allowed for appeals. At 8:45 a.m., all the men were led away to the conciergerie prison, including the acquitted Rodriguez, who was detained for the counterfeiting charge to be heard in Lille. In retrospect, both the verdicts and the sentences were more or less to be expected, and fair given the harsh laws and social mores prevailing at the time. Typically, the women were acquitted in a display of gentlemanly grace, for despite the compromising circumstances of each woman's arrest, it was condescendingly assumed that each woman was no more than an unwilling appendage of her male partner. Rodriguez, the only man acquitted, was of course the only one to have made full and frank admissions to the police. The sentences were not excessively savage, given the generally savage nature of the French state, although 3 of those sentenced to death had neither shot nor killed anybody. The 4 condemned men were transferred to the Lausanne prison. In a cell at the concierge, Edouard Caroy, Le Rocan, whose motto was La vie libre ou la mort, freedom or death, had decided that rather than end up in a convict prison, I prefer to die straight away. He had been secretly passed a sachet of potassium cyanide during the trial, and as soon as the cell door boomed shut, he swallowed the lot. This time, his 3rd attempt at suicide, he was successful. He left a short epitaph for posterity, written while awaiting the jury's verdict. I have lived through my wretched short life again tonight. I have had but little joy or happiness, and I confess that I may have made mistakes. All my dreams of happiness always collapsed just when I thought I was about to realize them. Not having known the joys of existence, I shall leave this realm of atoms without regret. When I feel my muscles, when I feel my strength, it's hard to imagine that all this can disappear forever on the strength of one statement of my guilt. I cannot believe that Monsieur Bertillon can, in cold blood, really dare to send me to my death, because he is obstinate, and doesn't wish to admit that he's wrong. Science is playing me a dirty trick. Was the 30-year-old Edward the man who liked to hear sentimental old love songs and set caged birds free? Really not guilty? Victor Kibalchich later wrote that Medj paid for another's crime, and in a subsequent book he suggested that the gloved murderer is free, and the cook, i.e. Medj, was simply the lookout. But in a more unguarded moment, in his private letter to Armand before the trial, he had declared how disgusted and deeply aggrieved he was that comrades for whom I've had affection since their earliest and purest passions, could commit such things as deplorable as the butchery of thighs. Mord was, remember, an old friend from Victor's teenage years, when they'd lived together in the libertarian colony in Bois Fort. It seems probable that both Caroy and Medj were indeed guilty. Victor himself was not unnaturally upset at his lengthy sentence, especially since Barrette admitted that it was she who had obtained the 2 Brownings that were found in Rue Fessard. Nevertheless, Victor wrote her a heartfelt farewell letter, finishing, I must ask a favor of you, my love. Never, never go back into that milieu. She took his advice and 6 months later sold for an unknown sum her Souvenirs d'Anarchie to the Liberal Daily, Le Matin, which tended to treat her erstwhile comrades as pathetic, tragic, or comic figures. On April 3, 1913, the Supreme Court rejected all the appeals, while simultaneously in Lausanne, prison warders made a thorough search of the condemned men's cells, where they discovered some knives and a quantity of poison, the latter presumably ready for use in anticipation that their appeals would be rejected. The next day, the cells were emptied of everything except the palliaces, and the four men were forced into wearing straitjackets. Immediately, they went on hunger strike in protest. The issue was only resolved 2 weeks later, due to an incident involving another prisoner, the anarchist Lacombe, now in custody. Typically, Lacombe had only turned to thieving after finding it extremely difficult to find work due to bosses' reluctance to employ a known anarchist. The previous September in Aubrays, he had shot and killed a pursuing ticket collector, and 2 months later he had done the same to a postmaster in Bezons. He took refuge with Ducret, aka Erlebach, who ran a libertarian bookshop in Passage de Clichy, but after a police raid in which he escaped unseen out of the back, he returned, interrogated Ducret, and then shot him as an informer. It was in February, during the mass trial of the illegalists, that hundreds of detectives, acting on false tip-offs, laid siege to 3 houses in the suburbs of Paris, where they supposed him to be hiding. In fact, Lacombe's end did not come in a Bonnot gang-style siege. On March 11th, he was spotted gazing at a booth in a local fair in La Villette, and quickly overpowered by 3 detectives. In his pockets, they found 2 Browning semi-autos and some sticks of dynamite. On April 16th, Lacombe tried a daring escape from Lassant by getting onto the roof during morning exercise. Unfortunately, he could find no way off. He spent 2 hours up there hurling slates at the warders and officials, ignoring his lawyer, Boucheron's request for him to come down, while the prisoners, their faces pressed against the iron bars of the windows, shouted, "Viva Lacombe! Viva l'anarchie!" Finally, he careered along the roof and hurled himself into space, avoiding the mattresses that had been placed down by the warders. His brief testament was published in Le Libertaire under the headline "Death of a Rebel." I would have liked to eat black bread with black hands, but I was forced to eat white bread with red hands. Fate bears the responsibility for all this. It was the whole set of circumstances which arose, and with which I was faced, that made me kill people of my own class, exploited like me, but ignorant and too zealous in defending the interests of their masters. I consider them as guilty as myself. I regret having killed workers, but aren't they made to kill each other patriotically on the battlefield or during strikes? After his death, the regime at Lassant was reviewed and the straitjackets were removed from the condemned men, Calaman, Saudi, Monnier, and Dudon. The executions were now set for 22nd of April at dawn. Their only hope now lay in making a plea for mercy to the newly incumbent President of the Republic, Poincaré, Fallier's successor. Alone of the four, Raymond refused to sign the plea. Saudi's mother wrote her own appeal for clemency on behalf of her son, who was barely out of his teens. In their cells, the four endeavored to complete the writing of their reminiscences, memoirs, wills, and letters. Dudon wrote short sketches of the four major participants, Bonnot, Garnier, Calaman, and Caroy, in which he said that Raymond was the most cultured and morally superior. Bonnot we saw as a professional, like Caroy, who would only kill in the last resort, as opposed to Garnier, who was the one to kill first without fleeing, determining to leave no witnesses. It was on this point that he argued with Bonnot. Yet Dudon felt that Garnier, who loved children and helped old people, was superior in his relation with his peers than Bonnot, who only had friends of occasion, always anarchists. All the same, Garnier tended to discount people who did not share his opinions. He talked a little, but sensibly, and liked to discuss ideas with Caroy and Bonnot, with whom he felt an affinity. He was the only one of the four who did not like reading, except for newspapers. They were all vegetarians and water-only drinkers, and fond of sport, although Bonnot had more of a penchant for music halls, dances, cafes, and casinos than the others. Nevertheless, they all loved the theater. It was clear from these observations that Dudon had spent a fair bit of time in the company of the gang in the months of January and February 1912, with the unfortunate consequence that he, too, was roped into the conspiracy, and was now awaiting execution. Raymond wrote his own story of the gang's activities, which was later scrutinized in the Parisian paper Le Journal. Despite his assertion that "I am not one of those who thinks it's necessary to dress the truth," written in a covering note asking his lawyers to arrange publication. The account almost certainly exaggerated the importance of his own role, although several parts rang true. He was completely unrepentant and boasted. We were more brutal and less hypocritical, that's all. Raymond spent his last few hours reading the Revue des Deux Mondes. Eli Monnier drew up his will. The collected works of the Enlightenment philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau went to his sister for the education of her son, while the rest of his books, including Darwin's Origin of Species and a complete edition of Rabelais, went to the Paris Municipal Library. Lastly, he wrote, I leave to society my ardent desire that one day, not far off, a maximum of comfort and independence will prevail in the provision of social needs, so that in one's leisure time an individual may be better able to devote himself to whatever makes life more beautiful, to education and all manner of science. I leave my revolver seized in the room at the time of my arrest to a Paris museum, in memory of an innocent victim of an affair that threw the country into a state of terror. And if the present will is executed, I desire that on the pistol grip be clearly inscribed the words of a great martyr, Thou shalt not kill. Andre Saudi, having completed his short autobiography, penciled an even more ironic will. I, Saudi, condemned to death by the representatives of social vengeance, otherwise known as justice, acknowledging that it is my expected duty, and having finalized the details of my last wishes, do hereby make it known to all sentient persons. 1. I bequeath to Monsieur Etienne, Minister of War, my jemmies, my marmosets, and my skeleton keys, to help him open the ways to social militarism through the 3-year law. 2. My cerebral hemispheres to the Dean of the Faculty of Medicine. 3. To the Anthropological Museum my skull, for which I order an exhibition to take place, with profits going to the soup communistes. 4. My hair to the Union of Barbers, and workers conscious or inebriated. Hair which will be put up for public sale and for the benefit of the cause and out of solidarity. 5. Finally, I bequeath to the paper L'Anarchie my autograph, so the priests and apostles of the philosophy may make use of it to the profit of their cynical individuality. In the margins he scrawled a poem titled La Vie. Paradis éphémère qui vole la sombre chimère et qui couvre un réalisme trompeur fait de souffrance et de douleur. On the afternoon of 20th April, the bolts were thrown back and the door to cell number 13 was pulled open. Dudon had been reprieved. For him, as for Medj, it was to be la guillotine sèche, meaning transportation to French Guiana, and in all probability Devil's Island, a life, if not a death sentence. The time set for the execution of the other 3 men was brought forward 24 hours to the following morning at dawn. An incessant drizzle was falling over Paris as the first of the spectators began to gather around midnight. All streets around the prison were blocked by a triple barrier, while numerous detectives were sent to infiltrate the crowd in case of trouble. The time of the executions had been brought forward precisely to avoid such a possibility. But this time there were to be no masses of outraged workers furiously battling with the police, as had happened at the execution of Labouf 3.5 years before. Extra police from the 10th Arrondissement, 4 brigades of reserves, and a squadron of Republican guards were drafted in to maintain order. At 2:30 a.m., the guillotine of a new type, with a silencer, was erected on the pavement of the tree-lined Boulevard Arago, and the public executioner. Diebler tested its working. Just before midnight, the Prefecture de Police issued a special card to 200 selected guests, which entitled them to watch the executions at close hand, among them being, of course, Gouchard, Gilbert, Lescauve, Robert, and Colmar. As dawn broke, there was a sudden flurry of activity inside the prison. At 4:10 a.m., the doors to cells 7, 11, and 12 were unlocked, and a warder growled, "Get up, let's go," followed by a deputy of the public prosecutor's office who monotoned to Saudi and Monnier, "Your plea is rejected." Andre Saudi asked for a cup of coffee and 2 croissants, and inquired whether his comrades had been pardoned. Following a reply in the negative, he soliloquized, "I haven't got the taking of any human life on my conscience. Things have come to a sorry end, but I'll have courage to the last. My poor mother." He was shivering as he dressed himself, but explained, like Mayor Bailey, it's due to the cold. Lastly, before leaving the cell, he added, "It's the best thing. It's better than the forced labor camp." Raymond was asked by the deputy public prosecutor if he had any revelations to make, but declared that he had nothing further to say. He scribbled a few lines on a piece of paper that he handed to his lawyer, Boucheron. Exiting the cell, he said aloud, "It's a day without a tomorrow. And then, it's a fine thing, eh? The final agony of a man." Monnier declared that he too would have courage to the end, then shook hands with some of the detectives from the Surete who were there. As he walked along the corridor, he mused, "I suspected yesterday that it would be this morning. I had a wonderful dream that I was making love." He addressed his lawyer, "Embrace Marie Bess for me." As the prisoners washed, Raymond asked for a glass of water, while Monnier turned down the offer of a glass of rum, saying jocularly, "I don't want to get drunk." The three men were chained hand and foot, then led out to the tumbril traditionally used to convey the condemned to the guillotine. They arrived in the Boulevard Arago at 4:35 a.m. Andre Saudi, still shivering, was the first to mount the scaffold. He turned and said, "It's so cold. Goodbye." Eli Monnier replied, "So long." Saudi was told to lie flat, and then secured in place. The blade fell, and his severed head tumbled into the basket. It was Raymond's turn next. He gave one of his habitual sardonic smiles, and addressing the few men gathered around the guillotine, repeated, "It's fine, eh? A man's final agony." Then he too was decapitated. Lastly came Eli Monnier, who said in a loud voice, "Goodbye to you all, messieurs, and to society as well." The blade fell for the third time. Kellerman's body was taken to the Faculty of Medicine as he had wished, to be used in the furtherance of scientific research. Monnier was buried in the cemetery of Ivry Parisien, and Saudi's body was claimed by his mother for burial in Beaugency, his birthplace.